It's because they can look at it and predictably say, yeah, at our given pace, we should be able to do that. And guess what? Because they're predictable now, they're going to continue to deliver more value within that same velocity. So good chance that we're actually going to exceed that target or do better than we think.
And that's the bonus piece there, is that welcome to the last Lean Agile Strategies and Tactics podcast. Lean Agile Strategies and Tactics for your personal, professional, and corporate growth in today's constantly changing and challenging business environments. So Dwayne, the world of Agile is often measured in what we call story points. And for anyone who doesn't know anything about Agile, they probably think, what are you, writing a book? But story points are the metric, or one of the metrics, that are often used to be able to measure the performance of a team. But there sort of lies the rub, which is that metric is flawed. So, and you have a particular opinion about this. So, Dwayne, why don't you share with us, first of all, what the definition of a story point is for you, and how you see it being used in the context of an Agile team and in the larger enterprise organization?
So let me start with more of the traditional definition of a story point, where it came from its inception. Is a story point was intended to help us become predictable. It was a unit of effort, but it wasn't just effort. It wasn't work. It included 4 key factors: volume, complexity, how complex is it, uncertainty, what don't we know about it, and knowledge, what do we know about it. So it's not just how much work do I do, how many times do I pump the handle or nail, hit the hammer or something like that. It's including the other factors. How difficult is it to hit that nail? How rigid is that pump handle? Those different things. It's not a measurement of work, but it does include volume. It's a measurement of the difficulty and the complexity and the amount of work to deliver on a piece of value. That's what a story point is supposed to be. And we use those in a relative sense, where we compare one story to another. Where the problem comes in is, well, let me take you back a ways. I was part of some of the early efforts in the Agile space. 2002, agilemanifesto.org. I don't think it was even out there yet. We were learning it on the fly. Story points weren't out there yet, but we started when story points, when we discovered that approach, we created a vacuum for leadership. Leadership from a traditional standpoint, we're used to measuring hours put in. How many hours have you accomplished on this effort? Well, that leaves you tied to, that means we know we're doing the right thing and we know how long it's going to take. Both of those are wrong. We don't know exactly what we need to do. That's been proven over and over, not when we start. And we don't know how long it's going to take. The unpredictability is absolutely there. So when we started using story points, we went to leadership and we said, okay, you can't measure team performance based on hours worked, because we're using this story point approach and it's much more effective, much faster for the teams. We have great discussions and all of that. But the problem is you can't use the hours anymore to measure team performance. And they said, great, then we'll use story points instead. Well, I know myself, and I know many other coaches I worked with made a mistake and said, well, you can't do that because each team uses a different scale to measure those. One story point to one team is not the same to another. We played sleight of hand, and that was a big mistake.
Let's dial in on that, though. What you just said about the difference between one team and another. So I think, for example, my experience in using story points, by example, is that I've seen it in 2 different ways, 2 different flavors. One, that story points are relative every time we start estimating or planning the work that we're going to do in an iteration or a sprint, meaning that we will resize or recontextualize what one story point means and then scale up from there. And then so we'll look at all the work that we need to do in the backlog. We will grade those pieces in the backlog based on our contextual story points, and then away we go. The second way, and this is the way that I've seen sort of fall flat in its face, if only because it was applied maybe incorrectly, was we standardize what story points mean, meaning that one story point means this for all the teams. and 2 and 5 and so on. But the predictability of that meant that the management level of the organization was pushing down on us the expectation of how many story points need to be completed in any given iteration. And the problem with that was that as we got close to the end of an iteration and we weren't meeting the KPI, those story points magically got adjusted, and all of a sudden we met our KPI. So that didn't result in any more value being completed. It just meant that we looked busier or busy enough as opposed to
better.
delivering value. And so you used a metaphor that I thought was really good around this, around sort of carrying a bucket of water or how many people a bike versus a bus can carry. So using that as the metaphor, explain to us the relativistic or the differences in story pointing relative to different teams.
Yeah. So first, let's back up a little bit and talk about the different approaches that are fairly common in the Agile community. One, there's the no estimation field. And I believe I understand where they're coming from, saying we don't need to do estimates. I believe what they're missing is two key factors. One, story points are about predictability. They're not about work output. They're not about work outcome or opportunity outcome. It's a measurement of predictability. Every team wants to improve their predictability level. But the other thing about story points is coming to a shared consensus on the story point value for a given story is all about clarifying assumptions. It's the conversation that's valuable. And so the no estimation camp, I believe, is missing that component, that it's a lot of clarifying assumptions. Now, as teams really mature, sometimes they can almost get to where they're finishing each other's sentences. No estimation starts to make a little more sense. But for most teams that are still fairly early in that journey, they need that clarified assumptions. They need to be on that same page. So that's one camp. The other one is that story points and velocity in particular, which velocity definition is how many story points on average can we deliver per iteration, per sprint, and so on. Velocity is a measurement of speed. It's not a measurement of how much we carry. So you mentioned the analogy of the carrying the buckets of water. If I have a 15-year-old and a 25-year-old, the 15-year-old's good shape for their age. The 25-year-old is maybe very strong and in the peak of athletic condition. If I have them carrying water, they're trying to put out a fire. That's the problem they're trying to solve. And they're carrying buckets of water. The 15-year-old is not going to carry as much water as the 25-year-old, but they're probably going at the same pace. They're walking back and forth at about the same speed. So their velocity is the same. What they can solve with that given velocity is different. One is more mature than the other. And the other analogy is when you start out, if you have a bicycle and you can go 30 miles an hour very predictably, and you have a bus that can go 30 miles an hour very predictably, if they start at the same time and they're heading the same destination, guess what? They arrive at the same time. Which one carries more? The bicycle can only carry one passenger, maybe two at best. But as that team matures, they go from a bicycle to a motorcycle, to a small car, to an SUV, to a small truck, a larger truck, up to a bus. So at that same pace, they can solve more problems within that. And one of the keys to that thinking is when you make story points, and especially velocity, about predictability, you've just eliminated one of the variables. You no longer have that unpredictable start, stop, going faster, going slower. They're delivering very predictably. Now, where we see gaps in ability to solve problems with that same capacity, now we know it's some other systemic problem. Product ownership's not engaged as they should be because they're in meetings all the time. Teams aren't able to collaborate, whatever it might be. When we make the teams incredibly predictable, the other systemic impediments become very apparent. When they're unpredictable, it's really hard to see.
So it sounds like points and velocity is a great way to understand how we're working, in the sense of how predictable we are, how much we can handle in any one chunk of time, and per team, sort of understanding what level, from a team level, what level of complexity can we handle based on the competency and capability of our team. But from the management level, especially
Yeah.
within enterprise organizations, they don't have velocity is a ineffective tool to measure the performance of a team, in the sense of we can measure how well we're working together and how we work well to deliver results, but the value of those results isn't measured in velocity, which is the sort of the key important thing that's of value to that management level. So
Yeah.
if we're looking at those two, it strikes me that flow metrics around lean methodology is the way to be able to marry that and bridge the gap. Velocity measures the competency, capability, and the effectiveness of Agile teams working together, but flow and the assessment of value, understanding what that value is, the mapping of that value stream, and the monitoring of when requests come in and value is delivered, is the way that the organization, from a more strategic level, can be able to map inputs to outputs and the constraints in between. Is that fair?
Some of it, yes. So let's talk about we'll briefly talk about flow, because that's a whole nother topic. That's several podcasts in a row. Where leadership are struggling is understanding that velocity is simply a predictability measurement, because they're missing then how do I measure the value of a team? What are they delivering? What problems are they solving? And what I've learned over the years working with companies is, on average, they struggle a great deal with having a shared common definition of value. What is value? If you don't know what it is, how do you measure it? And so that's the first step, is getting companies to get on the same page of what value is. And that takes several conversations. It takes some really assumption clarifying and so on. Once they get on that, again, another complete topic of how to define value, but once they have a shared definition of value, now we can take that predictability measurement of velocity and we can say, okay, the teams are delivering but are they continuously increasing how much value they're able to deliver? And we have to be careful. Predictability is not the same as efficiency. They're very different. For example, my sons, when they were teenagers, would predictably sleep until 12 noon in the summer. They weren't very efficient. They were very predictable. They're not the same metrics. But by isolating predictability and creating one less variable, now we can look at efficiency. You mentioned flow metrics. We can look at, are we efficient and are we delivering the right thing? Because value doesn't just rely on efficiency, it relies on accuracy. If we're doing the wrong thing very efficiently, we're not delivering value. It's a whole system. So there's a number of things you have to look at. And when I work with leadership to help them understand value, we talk about all those different things. Yes, value needs to be delivered efficiently, but it needs to be delivered effectively and accurately. Value has to have a definition that includes the customer perception of value. Whether it's internal to the organization or not, you have to have the customer perception of what that valuable thing is. Then when you get to that, through that relatively difficult conversation, you can start to measure value outcome. Are we delivering more value on a regular basis? I make this joke all the time. I will tell people, listen, give me a contract for $500,000 and I will come in and overnight I will double your velocity. All I need is access to your tool and I will just go in and double every story point value on each story. That doesn't do any good. That didn't increase what the teams are able to deliver. It simply made the perception in the wrong metric approach that we're delivering more. We're not. We just changed the measuring stick.
I guess that's the piece then. You mentioned earlier that we left managers sort of in a bind. We took away the metric that they were using to be able to measure essentially results and value and output, which was the time that their staff were working. But what we didn't give them was something to replace that. So
right, we created a vacuum.
yeah, we created this vacuum, and they tried to fill it, or sort of an instinctually knee-jerk reaction, want to fill it with velocity. But as we've mentioned, velocity is ill-equipped to meet that need, that itch that they want scratched. So it sounds like, in order to best meet the needs of that strategic management level of the organization, and to tie that in with the sort of the well-working, that's not the right way to say that, the way of working of these teams and how good they are at doing it, that the connective tissue there is the conversation, the value stream mapping, and the identification of value, so that we can all understand what it is that we're delivering that's worth anything to the customer, the client, whoever our the end user of what it is that we're producing, product or service, and that we can, based on that definition of value, we can use metrics around value to be able to measure how much any one team is contributing towards that product or service that delivers value to our customer.
Yeah, and the key is that velocity is an incredibly powerful metric. It is a team level metric. However, I still remember back to my early SAFE days, sitting in my SPC class back in 2012. Drew Gemolo was teaching that particular section, and he brought up SAFE's concept of normalized story points. I had been coaching Agile for quite some time already, close to 10 years already. And my reaction that lasted for a good 5 to 6 years was, you can't do that. You can't tell teams how big a story point is. It took me that long to get through that mental model of, wait a minute, that's not what normalized story points is saying. So here's how normalized story points works at a very simplistic level. We simply ask the team to use the same measuring stick. We want you all to use the same measuring approach. How big a given story is will go differently on the scale based on your experience, maturity, skill set, competency, size, and so on. It's going to, not size, but it's going to include those factors. But if we can get all teams on an Agile release train or in this larger effort using the same scale, for example, if you take my arm and simply say, a 1-point story is X, it's this much volume, complexity, uncertainty, and knowledge. Every team, we would like you to use that as a baseline. So when you look at something and you say, team A might say, we do that all the time. We could do that in our sleep. So that story we're looking at, to us, that's a 1-point story. Another team that has less experience, less competence in that area, but is growing, that might be a 3. But guess what? As they do that same story type a few times, that 3 might drop to a 2. And eventually, because they gain the same competency and skill set, it's now a 1. And then as teams continue to improve with the same velocity, the bicycle turns into a bus. Because now with that same predictability number, they can solve more business problems. They can deliver more that ambiguous value metric.
And I guess the key there that I'm hearing in what you're describing is, when I was talking about, for example, how I've seen that standardized model sort of fall flat in practice, was the KPIs and the performance management of the team was tied to the velocity metrics. And like you said, pay me $500,000, I'll double your the velocity of your team. Let me just,
it's a discount this week, $450 will do it.
Yeah, there you go. So like that tying the performance of the team in the sense of like intrinsic motivations and rewards for the team and their performance, tying it around velocity is an imperfect metric. Because like you said, rockstar team can pound out 10 1-point stories, no big deal. But those 10 1-point stories are all 3-point stories for the junior team. And that means it's a difference between 10 and 30 points for the same value of work. So instead of focusing on that, focus on the value delivered and use that as a metric over time to monitor how much that team is improving or not, with regards to how much they're increasing the value that they're delivering. Like you said, the Rockstars team might be able to maintain their high level of performance, but the more inexperienced team will improve over time. And they'll go from the bike to the motorcycle to the car to the bus. And you can track that over time with the amount of value that they are delivering. And that is a way, I would argue, based on what we're discussing today, a more accurate, a more informative, a more business-centric metric that we can use to better acknowledge and monitor the improvement of our teams.
Yeah, and carrying that normalized story point concept forward, which again, I know is a very touchy subject for a lot of people, a lot of the agile purists out there. I believe it's because they haven't had that epiphany I did after 5-6 years of discussing normalized story points. I could be wrong. I'm open to that. But that's what I believe is the case, is they're still stuck in that mode of we're telling teams how big the story is, and that's not what we're doing. But then you take that team level metric that by becoming predictable, we have removed one of the variables from product development. And the more things we can make consistent, the more we can focus on the inconsistent things that will increase flow. But you talked about leadership and management. Okay, what can they do with a team level metric? Here's the magic of normalized story points. When multiple teams are using that same yardstick, that same way of measuring, and they become highly predictable, we can look at a given effort and we can get a rough number of story points for something. Yes, the team would be involved and it's a swag number. Now we can do real forecasting. And this is one of the other things I've learned over the years. We have unfortunately taken the term forecasting and defined it as predicting. Forecasting is not a prediction tool, it's a learning tool. It's a what if scenario tool. So now leadership can look at it and say, from a normalized story point perspective, we can see capacity not only across a team, but across an art, across a large solution, across a fairly large body. And it's not perfect, but we can quickly see those problems that might be in the future. Wow, we have that milestone that has to be delivered. And based on what we know about that current epic combination of features, whatever, with the current predictability and capacity we have of the teams, we won't deliver that on time. What do we need to do? We need to shift our plan somehow. And again, you have to be careful because they're not looking at this as a bucket of work. It's not carry 100 gallons of water. It's carry enough water to put that fire out. But we're estimating, forecasting that it's going to take about 500 gallons of water. Okay? Based on our current predictable delivery rate, how long will that take us? Are we going to get the fire out in time? So now leadership can use what is meant as a team level metric. And as long as they have the right mindset, because this is a slippery slope, it can be very dangerous in a less mature lean agile mindset approach. But when they gain that true lean agile leadership approach, they can use that forecasted capacity to discover those issues, those problems before they occur. And they can adjust plans accordingly. Adjust what they're asking the teams to take on for problems to solve. They can perhaps shift some of the budgeting and funding so that they have more teams working on the same problem. It gives leadership a truly usable metric to look at the future and see what changes we have to make. Not committing teams, you're going to do this much work, but anticipating that the team should be able to solve this problem within this time frame, or even worse, when we don't anticipate they will, what do we do? It's not about making the teams work harder and longer. It's about fitting within what we have.
So bringing that home, then it's around, at the end of the day, how we use story points. As you say, it's a way to be able to create predictability, so that from a forecasting perspective, we can better appreciate and understand how much we can reliably do today. And then map that forward as an estimation of, okay, this is what we can do historically up to now. Therefore, based on the time and resources and the amount of work that we think is coming, we can realistically predict that this is how long it might take. And when those business environmental conditions shift based on economic circumstances, a shift in the marketplace, or a change in funding or budget, we can, based on the predictability of story points and velocity, we can use that information, that data, to be able to target, pivot, or redirect our energy and effort towards the things of greatest value to our customers, clients, or the organization. Again, how we apply that energy and effort to deliver the value, which is, again, at the end of the day, the thing we're delivering that value for the organization.
Yeah, and to summarize this topic, for those listening, I just want them to be open to the journey I went over. And it's not to say that my understanding is complete, is concrete, is absolutely accurate, but open your mind to the possibility that velocity is simply a predictability measurement. And if that's the case, that we can have a common scale that we measure against from team to team, art to art, and so on. And by doing that, we can have greater predictability at a much greater scale, which allows leadership to make more predictable plans. They can now start to plan for release dates and meeting regulatory requirements and so forth, not because they're telling the teams, hey, you have to work weekends because this has to be done. It's because they can look at it and predictably say, yeah, at our given pace, we should be able to do that. And guess what? Because they're predictable now, they're going to continue to deliver more value within that same velocity. So good chance that we're actually going to exceed that target or do better than we think.
And that's the bonus piece there, is that we always think about it in the context of negativity and constraints, in the sense of I'm not going to be able to do as much as I thought I or should or we predicted we should do, but rather look at it from the perspective, if I'm better able to predict and forecast because of this dependability, predictability, reliability metric I'm using, then I can look forward and say, you know what? There are these things that we thought were outside of the scope or outside of the budget or outside of our schedule. Well, you know what? These are key value-added things or bonuses, stretch goals for our product or service based on our predictability, based on our velocity. We know that we can take those on and have them completed within the time frame. Let's do that. Or we can at least make the choice whether to proactively do that or not. So there's, again, it's like we don't have to think about it in the negative context, but we can think about it in a positive context. And really, isn't that what we're all trying to do? Work in a happy, positive place, do good things.
And the biggest reason that I still advocate for stories, 15, 20 years after it was first presented, I think it's about 15 years now, is because by eliminating one of the variables, we make our ability to deliver highly predictable. Now we can focus on the other variables, which is flow efficiency, removing impediments, so that we take that same speed and we're able to deliver more value with that same speed.